The wind howled like a living thing outside as I stumbled through the knee-deep snow, each step an agony as the cold gnawed through my coat and bit into my skin. My fingers were stiff and numb. My breath came in ragged gasps that crystallized instantly in the frozen air. Somewhere in the distance, the warm yellow glow of my family's house shone like a promise of safety, but I knew that behind those walls was no refuge for me tonight. I never thought my own sister would smile as she turned the lock, leaving me outside in the worst blizzard our town had seen in decades. Snow pelted my face in sharp, stinging bursts, and I felt the wet warmth of blood trickling from a cut on my forehead, the result of a slip on the icy front steps when I had first realized I was locked out. My boots were soaked through my toes, burning with that strange, painful heat that meant the cold was sinking deep into the flesh. I could barely hear anything over the roar of the wind, but in my head I could still hear the sound of her laugh as she stepped away from the window, disappearing into the warm light inside. Amy. My older sister had always known how to hurt me without leaving visible scars. Tonight, she decided visible ones were fine too. The night had started like any other tense winter evening in our home, but it had ended with me walking away from the front door, desperate to find any shelter, my heart pounding with equal parts fear and rage. My father's voice echoed in my memory, cold and certain when he finally appeared at the side door after I had pounded for nearly 20 minutes. "Amy told me what you did earlier. You deserved this." Then he shut the door in my face, leaving me in the screaming wind. What I did earlier. That was the phrase that ran through my mind as I stumbled forward through the blinding white. All I had done was remind Amy to clean up after herself in the kitchen when she left dirty dishes for me to wash after working a full day from home. It had been a passing comment, not even sharp, but with Amy, any perceived slight became a weapon she could use. And tonight, with the storm rolling in and the temperature dropping below zero, she had found her perfect opportunity to teach me what she called respect. My eyes watered from the cold and from the bitter humiliation of knowing that my own family had turned against me so completely that they would risk my life. The wind cut across my face again, and I imagined the headlines in the local paper if I collapsed here and never got up. Woman found frozen 2 blocks from home. Family says they thought she went somewhere else. That image burned in my mind, and I clenched my jaw. I would not give them the satisfaction of telling that story. I forced my legs to move faster, ignoring the way my knees threatened to buckle with every step. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the shock and the growing numbness, a different kind of cold was taking root. It was the kind that stripped away any lingering loyalty, any illusions about love or safety in that house. This was not just a cruel moment. This was the moment everything would change. I did not know then how far I would go to make sure they could never do this to me again. But the seed was planted in that storm, watered with snow and blood, and I swore with every freezing step that this would be the last night I ever begged for warmth from people who took pleasure in watching me suffer. I grew up in a small town in the Midwest, the kind of place where winter is not just a season, but a test of endurance where January storms can bury cars overnight and turn roads into slick ribbons of ice. Our family home was a sturdy 2-story with peeling white paint and a creaky porch built by my grandfather and passed down to my father like some sort of legacy. Inside those walls, my life was shaped by the unyielding will of my father Robert and the constant presence of my older sister Amy. From the outside, we looked like any other family. Dad worked for the local utility company, a man people described as dependable and tough. The kind of neighbor who would help dig your car out of the snowbank in the morning, but lecture you about your life choices that same afternoon. My mother Linda was quieter, working part-time at the library, gentle in her manner, but rarely willing to challenge my father. Amy, 4 years older than me, was the golden child in my father's eyes. She had a way of making him laugh, of turning even her mistakes into charming stories. When she forgot chores, Dad would say she was busy or tired. When I forgot chores, I would be told I was lazy and ungrateful. Amy learned early how to bend situations in her favor, how to plant ideas in Dad's head so that they grew into accusations against me. I was the quiet one, the girl who read books in her room, helped Mom with dinner, and tried to avoid conflict. But conflict had a way of finding me. I remember one winter when I was 10, Amy locked me in our shared bedroom after school and took the only set of gloves we had that fit me. She told Dad I had lost them, and I spent the next week walking to school with red, raw hands while he scolded me for being irresponsible. Another time when I was 14, she told him I had skipped school, leaving out the part where she had dared me to sneak out for an hour during lunch and then stayed behind to make sure he knew I was gone. Each time something like this happened, I told myself it was just sibling rivalry that someday we would grow out of it, but Amy never grew out of the need to win, and Dad never stopped rewarding her for it. The dynamic in our house was clear. Amy could do no wrong, and I was expected to accommodate her needs without question. If she wanted the last piece of pie, I was told to give it up. If she needed a ride, I was told to rearrange my plans. As we got older, the pattern didn't change. Amy drifted from one short-term job to another, always with an excuse or a story about why it hadn't worked out while I worked steadily through college and into my first real job. Even then, Dad seemed to think my role was to support her financially if necessary and to make sure she was comfortable. The older I got, the more I noticed Mom's silence. She never joined in Dad's lectures, but she never contradicted him either. Once, after Amy had convinced him to give her money from my savings account for a business opportunity, I found Mom in the kitchen and asked why she didn't speak up. She just shook her head and said, "It's not worth the fight." That phrase became her shield, but to me it sounded like surrender. By the time I moved back home to help after Mom's surgery, I thought I was prepared for the old family patterns to resurface. I told myself I could endure Amy's attitude for a few months, that I could bite my tongue and avoid the drama. But I underestimated how quickly those patterns could escalate, how easily small slights could be twisted into justifications for cruelty. The blizzard night didn't come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of years of favoritism manipulation and my father's belief that discipline sometimes meant humiliation. In our house, control was currency, and Amy had been rich in it for as long as I could remember. I was still clinging to the idea that family meant something, but the storm was coming and it would strip away whatever illusions I had left. By the time I was 27, I had settled into a life that I thought I could manage even under my father's roof. After years of living in the city, I had moved back home temporarily after Mom's knee surgery, telling myself it was only until she was fully mobile again. I was working remotely for a small but stable accounting firm, my days spent at the desk in my childhood bedroom, balancing spreadsheets and answering client emails. It was not glamorous, but it was steady, and it paid the bills, something I took pride in, especially given how unpredictable the job market had been. Amy, on the other hand, had not held a steady job in over a year. She drifted between short-term retail positions and long stretches of doing nothing in particular. Dad never pushed her to find something permanent. Instead, he framed her unemployment as a result of bad luck or unfair bosses. That meant that while I worked, Amy slept and watched television in the living room and left a trail of dishes and clutter behind her. Our father's rules were clear but unevenly applied. I was expected to be available at all times to run errands or do extra chores, while Amy could opt out whenever she felt like it. If I objected, Dad would give me a sharp look and say things like she has enough on her plate or stop being so selfish. Mom stayed neutral as always, keeping her focus on physical therapy and letting the two of us orbit each other in wary silence. The house itself felt different now that I was an adult living in it again. The rooms seemed smaller, the walls thinner. Privacy was scarce. Amy had taken over the spare room to use as a walk-in closet, leaving me no space for anything beyond my own essentials. My father's control was constant, though sometimes subtle. He would ask about my work schedule under the guise of interest, but then use that information to decide when I should be available for family errands. He commented on my finances in a way that made me feel like I was still a teenager being lectured. Amy knew exactly how to use his attitude to her advantage. If she wanted something done, she would drop hints to Dad, and within hours, I would be ordered to handle it. The tension simmered just beneath the surface most days. There were occasional flare-ups, like the time she left dirty laundry in the dryer for days and snapped at me when I needed to use it, or when she ate the lunch I had prepared for work and claimed she thought it was for everyone. But I kept telling myself not to engage. I reminded myself that the arrangement was temporary. I would save money, help Mom recover, and then find my own place. What I did not realize was that Amy saw my restraint as weakness and my father saw it as compliance. To them, it was confirmation that I would accept whatever treatment they decided I deserved. The winter had been brutal even before the night of the blizzard, with heavy snowfalls and bitter winds that kept most people indoors. For me, it was just another reminder of how trapped I felt in that house. I could not have guessed that the cold outside would soon be nothing compared to the chill of being deliberately locked out by my own sister. The patterns of our family were about to converge into a single act that would redefine everything I thought I knew about loyalty and safety. It was late January when the weather warnings began flashing across every local channel, predicting a historic blizzard set to hit our county that evening. Schools announced closures, businesses sent employees home early, and the air outside already carried that heavy stillness before a storm. By 4 o'clock, the sky was the color of steel, and snow was beginning to fall in thick, lazy flakes. I was wrapping up my work for the day when Mom asked if I could run to the store for a few essentials things she wanted to have on hand in case we were snowed in for a couple of days. I grabbed my coat and boots and headed for the door. Amy was sprawled on the couch scrolling through her phone, and without looking up, she said, "Pick me up a few things too," rattling off a list of snacks and a specific brand of tea she liked. Her tone made it clear she was not asking, but instructing. I bit back a sigh and agreed, wanting to avoid another scene. The roads were already slick and the wind was picking up, but I made it to the store, filled our list, and even added a few treats I thought Amy might like in a small attempt to keep the peace. The return trip was slower visibility dropping as the snowfall thickened. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the wind was strong enough to rock the car slightly. I gathered the bags, my fingers aching from the cold even through gloves, and trudged to the front door. I expected to find it unlocked since Mom was home, but when I turned the knob, it did not budge. Surprised, I set the bags down and knocked. No answer. I knocked louder. Through the front window, I caught a glimpse of Amy standing in the hallway. Our eyes met for a brief second before she smirked, reached for the light switch, and plunged the hallway into shadow. I stared in disbelief, knocking again, calling her name. The wind whipped around me, blowing snow into my hair and down the back of my coat. I pulled out my phone and called her, but it rang unanswered. I called Dad's number next, thinking maybe he had just gotten home and locked the door without realizing I was out. He picked up on the third ring, and before I could speak, he said, "Amy told me what you did earlier. You deserved this." His tone was flat, almost bored, as if explaining a simple fact. Then he hung up. I stood there shivering, my breath catching in my throat. What I did earlier. The only interaction we had that day was me asking her to clean her dishes from the sink before Mom started dinner. Apparently, that had been enough to twist into a story that painted me as disrespectful. I knocked again, louder this time, my knuckles throbbing from the cold, but there was nothing. The only sound was the wind and the faint rattle of the storm door against its frame. The snow was piling up fast, and I could already feel the damp seeping through my boots into my socks. My cheeks burned from the icy air, and my fingertips were going numb. After 20 minutes of trying every door and even the garage, it was clear they were not going to let me in. The realization hit like a fresh blast of wind. This was not an accident. This was a decision. My sister had locked me out during a life-threatening storm, and my father had chosen to endorse it. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, part panic, part anger. The storm was intensifying, the temperature dropping by the minute. I knew staying there was not an option, but walking away meant braving the elements with no guarantee of safety. As the snow stung my face and the world outside the porch blurred into white, I understood with bone-deep clarity that I was on my own. The wind clawed at my coat as I stepped off the porch, dragging the grocery bags with me, before realizing I could not carry them far in these conditions. My hands were already stiff and the straps cut into my palms, so I left the bags on the porch, their contents probably freezing solid within minutes. The snow was coming down so heavily now that the streetlights were faint halos in the distance. I pulled my scarf higher over my mouth and nose and started toward the side of the house, thinking maybe the back door would be open. It was not. I tried the mudroom door, the basement hatch, even tapped on the window to Mom's room, hoping she might hear me, but there was nothing. The cold was seeping into my bones, my breath coming in ragged bursts, each inhale burning my lungs. Finally, I circled back to the front porch and pounded again. My knuckles felt like stone, and every impact sent a jolt of pain through my hand. Then the side door creaked open and my father appeared, his figure outlined in the faint glow from the kitchen behind him. Relief surged for a moment, but it died instantly when I saw his expression. No concern, no confusion, just that familiar look of judgment. He did not even open the door fully, just enough to speak. "Amy told me what you said to her," he began, his voice sharp in the frozen air. "You think you can disrespect her in this house and get away with it." My jaw dropped. Disrespect? For asking her to clean up after herself? "Dad, it's freezing. Please just let me in and we can talk." His eyes narrowed. "Actions have consequences, and maybe a little time out there will teach you a lesson." I felt the words hit harder than the wind. "You are seriously leaving me out here? You could freeze," he said, but not with sympathy, almost as if it was a dare. Then he shut the door, the latch clicking into place like a verdict. For a moment, I stood rooted to the spot, stunned, until the cold drove me to move. My body was shaking uncontrollably, now my legs heavy as I stepped into the deepening snow. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to find shelter fast. The nearest neighbor I knew well lived 3 blocks away. It might as well have been 3 miles in this weather, but it was my only option. I turned into the wind, each step a battle. The snowdrifts caught at my boots, and more than once I stumbled, my knees buckling as the icy ground met my shins. About halfway there, my foot slipped on a patch of ice hidden beneath the powder, and I went down hard, my forehead striking something sharp. Warmth spread across my brow and into my eye, and I realized with a sick jolt that I was bleeding. The wind stole the sound of my gasp, but the pain made my vision swim. I pushed myself upright, ignoring the sting, and kept moving. The world was a blur of white and gray, and my body was growing heavier with every step. My fingers were so numb I could barely feel them inside my gloves. I forced myself to keep my head down, counting steps, focusing on the dark shape of the neighbor's house, slowly taking form through the curtain of snow. I imagined what Amy was doing at that exact moment, maybe curled on the couch with a blanket, warm and smug, knowing exactly where I was. The thought sparked a flicker of heat in my chest that had nothing to do with the weather. Rage was a better fuel than fear. By the time I reached the neighbor's driveway, I was staggering, my boots sliding on the ice. I half fell onto the porch and knocked weakly on the door. It opened almost immediately, and the blast of warm air was like stepping into another world. "Oh my God, what happened to you?" the neighbor gasped, ushering me inside. I could not form the whole story, only managed locked out storm cold as she sat me down near the heat vent and called 911. As the shock settled in, I realized that whatever had just happened was not just cruelty in the heat of the moment. It was calculated, and it had crossed a line I could never uncross. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their boots tracking melting snow across the neighbor's entryway as they knelt beside me, checking my vitals and shining a light into my eyes. One of them muttered about early hypothermia, the other pressed a gauze pad to the cut on my forehead and wrapped a blanket around my shoulders. The warmth was almost painful at first, like pins and needles stabbing through my frozen skin. I answered their questions as best I could, my voice shaking more from adrenaline than cold now. When they asked how I had ended up outside in such conditions, I hesitated for only a second before saying, "My sister locked me out, and my father refused to let me in." Their expressions tightened, but they kept working, helping me to my feet and guiding me toward the waiting ambulance. My neighbor hovered nearby, clearly horrified, promising she would give a statement to the police. At the hospital, the ER was busy with storm-related injuries, but the staff moved me through quickly. They cleaned and closed the cut on my forehead with butterfly strips, wrapped my hands to warm them gradually, and monitored my core temperature until it returned to safe levels. A young nurse clucked her tongue as she wrote notes on my chart, shaking her head when I explained the situation in more detail. "You're lucky someone found you," she said quietly. "Another hour in that cold, and we'd be having a very different conversation." Mom arrived not long after, her face pale and drawn eyes flicking over the bandage on my head and the red marks on my cheeks. She took my hand, her own still cold from the drive, and whispered, "What happened, sweetheart?" When I told her, she closed her eyes for a long moment, then said, "Your father told me you left to clear your head after an argument with Amy. He made it sound like you didn't want to come back in." I laughed bitterly, a short sound that hurt my throat. "That's convenient," I said. She pressed her lips together, clearly torn between disbelief and the knowledge that Dad had twisted stories before. The police officer who came to take my statement listened carefully, jotting notes, and confirmed they would speak to both Amy and my father. It was clear from his tone that he considered their actions dangerous, possibly criminal. When I was finally discharged with instructions to rest and stay warm, I felt a strange calm settling in. The fear and shock of the night were still there, but beneath them was something sharper, more deliberate. This was no longer about enduring family tension until I could move out. They had crossed into territory that endangered my life. As Mom drove me home to gather my belongings, I decided silently that I would not be staying under that roof another night. I would find somewhere else, even if it meant sleeping on a friend's couch, and I would not let this pass without consequence. They thought they had the power to decide whether I lived or froze. They were about to find out they had just lost any control over me at all. The next morning, I called in sick to work, not because I was physically incapable of logging on, but because I knew I needed the entire day to start taking back control of my life. My hands still ached when I flexed them. The cut on my forehead throbbed with every heartbeat, and my body felt like I had run a marathon through ice. But more than that, there was a constant loop in my head replaying the look on Amy's face when she turned away from the window and the sound of my father's voice saying, "You deserved this." I started by calling a lawyer recommended by one of my colleagues, explaining the situation in as much detail as I could. She didn't mince words. Locking you out in dangerous weather conditions, especially during a declared blizzard, can be considered reckless endangerment. Given the family relationship and the fact that you were visibly injured, there's a strong argument for domestic abuse charges. I felt a grim satisfaction at her matter-of-fact tone. For years, I had been told to let things go to avoid making trouble, but now someone was confirming that what they had done wasn't just cruel, it was illegal. The lawyer advised me to start collecting evidence immediately. That meant calling my neighbor to get her statement in writing, requesting a copy of the 911 call she made, and asking the hospital for my medical records from the night before. It also meant gathering anything that showed the pattern of behavior in my family, especially recent incidents. That was when Mom quietly slipped me a small USB drive later that afternoon. "I don't want to be in the middle of this," she said, "but you should have this." It was a recording from a few days earlier when Amy had been on the phone with a friend in the kitchen. In it, Amy laughed as she said, "Sometimes she needs to be reminded who's in charge around here. Dad agrees she's too mouthy lately." The smugness in her voice made my skin crawl, but it was exactly the kind of proof I needed to show intent. I thanked Mom, though I could see the guilt in her eyes for not stepping in sooner. I spent the rest of the day documenting everything, even down to the text Amy had sent me earlier in the week telling me to learn my place. The lawyer said we would move forward with both a protective order and a police report, but she also encouraged me to think about how I wanted to confront them. That was when the idea took root. Instead of just letting the legal system quietly handle it, I could bring the truth into the open where everyone in our extended family could see it. My father thrived on controlling the narrative, on making sure people only saw his version of events. If I stripped that away in front of people whose opinions he cared about, it would be a blow he couldn't ignore. I started planning a family gathering under the pretense of discussing arrangements for Mom's continued recovery. I would invite our aunts, uncles, and a few close family friends, the same people who had heard Dad's side of countless stories over the years. Only this time, I would be the one telling it, and I would have the proof to back it up. It felt dangerous, a part of me still programmed to avoid direct confrontation with him, but another part, one that had been frozen and humiliated, was ready. As I finalized the plan, I realized this wasn't just about punishing them. It was about reclaiming my own credibility, my own voice. If they wanted to play power games, I was done playing defense. The storm had ended outside, but inside me something far stronger was gathering, and it was going to hit them harder than they expected. The family meeting was set for the following Saturday afternoon, and by Thursday, I had confirmed attendance from nearly everyone I wanted there. I told them vaguely that it was about Mom's recovery and some important updates they should hear in person. I knew that framing it this way would make Dad feel like he had to attend, and Amy would never pass up an opportunity to play the devoted daughter in front of relatives. I spent Friday night organizing everything I had gathered. On my laptop, I queued the audio file of Amy bragging to her friend about putting me in my place. I had printed copies of my hospital discharge papers and the police report from the night of the blizzard. I also had the neighbor's written statement describing how she found me on her porch bleeding and shivering. For visuals, I had photos from the hospital showing my injury, my hands red and swollen from the cold and the stitches on my forehead. I arranged them all in a neat folder labeling each piece clearly. When Saturday came, the living room was filled with the sound of coats being shrugged off and polite greetings. Mom was in the kitchen making coffee, her face tight with nerves. Dad sat in his usual armchair, leaning back as if he were presiding over something, and Amy sat on the couch with an expression that mixed boredom and suspicion. I waited until everyone had a cup of coffee and settled in before I spoke. "Thank you for coming. I know you all care about Mom, but there's another reason I asked you here." I took a deep breath and continued. "Last week during the blizzard, something happened that I need you all to understand fully." I walked them through the events step by step, from leaving for the store to finding the front door locked to my father telling me I deserved it. I didn't raise my voice, but I didn't soften the details either. Then I played the audio recording. Amy's laughter and words filled the room sharp and ugly against the quiet. A few relatives shifted uncomfortably. One of my aunts shot Amy a look that could cut glass. Dad started to speak, but I held up my hand. "I'm not done." I passed around the hospital photos and documents explaining each one. The room was silent except for the occasional murmur of disbelief. Finally, I read the neighbor's statement aloud, her words describing my condition when she opened the door. When I finished, I let the silence hang for a moment before I said, "This isn't just about one night. This is a pattern of control, manipulation, and abuse that I have lived with for years. And last week, it nearly cost me my life." Amy's face had gone pale and Dad's jaw was tight, but neither of them looked repentant. Instead, Dad said, "You're making this into something it's not." I looked directly at him. "No, I'm showing people what it actually is. You don't get to control the story this time." I turned to the others. "I'm pursuing legal action, and I wanted you all to hear the truth from me before the rumors start. I don't expect everyone to take sides, but I do expect you to think about what you've just seen and heard." The weight of the moment was tangible. My uncle cleared his throat and said, "I believe you, and I'm ashamed I didn't see it sooner." Others nodded in agreement, some glaring openly at Amy and Dad. The shift in the room was undeniable. Their usual social armor had been punctured. Dad stood abruptly and left the room muttering under his breath. Amy followed, but not before throwing me a look of pure venom. I stayed seated, feeling the adrenaline pulse through me. This was the first time I had openly challenged them in front of witnesses, and they had no power to shut it down. As people began to leave, a few came over to quietly tell me they supported me, that they'd be willing to testify if it came to that. When the last coat was taken from the hook and the door closed, I sat back on the couch drained but satisfied. They wanted to teach me a lesson in obedience. Instead, I had taught them a lesson in exposure. The game they had been playing for years had just changed, and for once, I was holding the winning hand. In the days after the meeting, the fallout was immediate. Word spread quickly through the family and into the community because small towns rarely keep secrets. People who had always taken my father's word at face value began to look at him differently. Amy's friends, the ones who had been happy to gossip with her about me in the past, started pulling away. She tried to spin a different version of events, claiming I had staged the entire thing to make her look bad. But the combination of the audio recording medical records and the neighbor's eyewitness account made her look desperate and dishonest. The police followed up with me midweek, letting me know they had officially opened an investigation into reckless endangerment and domestic abuse. My father was interviewed, and while he denied intending to harm me, he admitted to refusing me entry because he believed I had disrespected Amy. That admission alone was enough for the case to move forward. My lawyer filed for a protective order against both of them, which the judge granted almost immediately given the evidence and the weather conditions on the night in question. Dad was furious, but now he was forced to communicate through legal channels, no more surprise encounters or controlling speeches. Amy's situation unraveled even faster. Without Dad's unwavering defense in the eyes of others, her behavior came under scrutiny. Relatives she had manipulated for years stopped returning her calls. The friend she was living with asked her to leave within a month, citing tension and unwanted attention from the investigation. For the first time, she was facing the consequences of her actions without someone else shielding her. I found an apartment across town, small but warm, with a landlord who took security seriously. The first night there, I locked the door and sat in the quiet, feeling a strange combination of grief and relief. I knew the legal process would take time, but the immediate change in my environment was a victory in itself. I didn't have to glance over my shoulder to see if Amy was listening or brace myself for my father's next lecture. My neighbor checked in regularly, dropping by with groceries or just to talk. She told me she had already spoken to the police twice and was willing to testify if needed. Her support reminded me that family could be chosen, that trust was earned through actions, not bloodlines. As winter dragged on outside, I focused on building a new routine. Work from my small dining table, evening walks when the weather allowed, and phone calls with friends who had been waiting for me to reclaim my independence. The scars on my forehead and hands began to fade, but the memory of that night stayed sharp, not as a source of pain, but as a reminder of the moment I stopped letting them decide my worth. The investigation was still ongoing, but regardless of the final outcome, I had already won. In the only way that mattered to me, I had walked away and left them standing in the cold of their own making. Moving into my own space was like learning how to breathe again after years of holding my breath. The apartment was nothing fancy, just 2 rooms and a small kitchen, but every inch of it was mine. I bought secondhand furniture, hung soft curtains, and placed a heavy lock on the door that clicked with a reassuring finality each night. My lawyer advised me to keep meticulous records of any attempted contact, and while neither Dad nor Amy reached out directly, I still caught sight of them occasionally around town. I would be in the grocery store and feel the weight of their eyes from another aisle, but they never approached. The silence between us was both a relief and a sadness I couldn't quite shake. I had grown up believing that no matter what family was a safety net, something to catch you when the world became too much. Now I understood that for some, family was the thing you needed protection from. I joined a local support group for survivors of domestic abuse, unsure at first if my story belonged in a room with people who had endured years of physical violence. But when I spoke about the night of the blizzard, about the deliberate choice to leave me outside in life-threatening weather, heads nodded around the circle. Abuse, one woman said, is about power and control. It doesn't always leave bruises you can see. That validation was like a door opening in my mind. I began to share more, not just in the group, but at a community workshop on winter safety that invited residents to speak about emergency preparedness. I told my story carefully without naming names, focusing on the importance of checking on neighbors and recognizing the dangers of extreme cold. People thanked me afterward, some with tears in their eyes, and one older man said he wished someone had spoken up like that when his sister had been in a similar situation years ago. Slowly, my days filled with things that were mine alone, projects at work that earned praise from clients, Saturday mornings at the farmer's market, Sunday afternoons curled up with a book. The constant tension that had once lived in my shoulders began to ease. I even started planning for the future again, setting aside money not just for bills, but for the trips I had always wanted to take. The legal case against Amy and Dad was still unfolding, but the protective order meant they couldn't come near me, and that alone gave me room to heal. Sometimes at night when the wind rattled the windows and snow fell in thick silence outside, I would think about that evening on the porch, about the sting of the cold and the sound of the lock clicking. The memory didn't crush me anymore. It reminded me of the moment I understood that survival wasn't just about enduring, it was about refusing to let someone else decide whether you lived or froze. As the months passed, I found myself becoming stronger in ways I hadn't anticipated. The nightmares that used to wake me in the middle of the night, visions of snow and darkness, and Amy's smirk behind the window, began to fade. They were replaced by dreams of driving down long, open roads or walking through quiet city streets with no one waiting at home to demand explanations. My therapist reminded me regularly that healing was not a straight line, that there would be days when old wounds felt raw again, but she also pointed out how far I had come since that night. She was right. I could now pass the old family house without feeling my stomach twist into knots. I could run errands in town without scanning the parking lot for their car. And most importantly, I could trust myself to act when boundaries were crossed. That trust in myself became the foundation for something bigger. When the local library announced they were hosting a series of talks on community safety, I volunteered to lead one focused on surviving extreme winter conditions and recognizing early signs of hypothermia. I used my own experience as an example, careful to keep the focus on the lessons rather than the personal details, but the impact was clear. People lingered afterward to share their own close calls, some admitting they had never thought about how quickly cold weather could become deadly. The librarian asked if I would consider running a monthly workshop, and before I knew it, I was speaking regularly to small but attentive groups, blending practical advice with subtle reminders about self-protection and boundary setting. It felt like I was turning something ugly into something useful, and that gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't expected. Meanwhile, the case against Amy and Dad reached its conclusion. There were no dramatic courtroom scenes like in movies, but there was a moment in the judge's chambers where I heard the official acknowledgement that their actions had been reckless and dangerous. Amy was ordered to attend mandatory counseling and perform community service, while Dad received a substantial fine and a formal warning that any violation of the protective order would lead to jail time. Neither looked at me when it was over, but I didn't need them to. The consequences were on record now, a public mark against their carefully maintained image. That mattered more to me than any apology they might have forced themselves to give. On the anniversary of the blizzard, I stood by my apartment window watching the snow fall in soft spirals under the streetlight. The air inside was warm, the hum of the heater steady. I thought about how different this night felt compared to the one a year ago. There was no pounding on locked doors, no begging for warmth from people determined to see me suffer. There was just me in my own space, safe because I had chosen to make it so. I poured a cup of tea and raised it in a silent toast to the version of myself who had walked through that storm and made it back bleeding but alive. She had carried me to this moment, and I wasn't going to waste it. The year after the storm brought changes, I could not have imagined when I first stood on that porch with snow in my hair and blood on my face. My work life flourished as I took on new projects and earned a promotion to senior accountant, a position that gave me both a higher salary and the flexibility to continue my community workshops. The library series had grown so much that we had to move to the town hall to accommodate the number of attendees, some of whom drove in from neighboring counties after hearing about the sessions through local news coverage. Standing in front of those groups, I spoke about practical safety measures. Yes, but I also talked about the deeper message I had learned that knowing your worth and refusing to accept mistreatment is as vital to survival as any emergency kit. The impact was visible in the nods, the quiet notes taken, the hands raised to share personal stories. It was proof that my pain had not been wasted. My personal circle had changed too. Friends who had once hesitated to get involved in my family drama were now regular fixtures in my life, showing up for game nights, helping with workshop logistics, or simply checking in over coffee. My neighbor, the one who had opened her door to me that night, had become a trusted friend. We celebrated holidays together, her warmth and humor a constant reminder that kindness can come from unexpected places. The protective order remained in place, and while Amy and Dad kept their distance physically, I occasionally heard updates through relatives. Amy had completed her community service but struggled to hold steady work. Dad kept a lower profile, attending fewer community events, his reputation permanently dented. I felt no satisfaction in their struggles beyond the relief that they could no longer reach me. Forgiveness was not on my horizon, but neither was active resentment. They had become irrelevant to my day-to-day life. On the first truly warm day of spring, I invited my closest friends and a few supporters from the workshops to my apartment for dinner. It was a small space, but we filled it with laughter, the scent of roasting vegetables, and the sound of clinking glasses. At one point, I stood in the kitchen doorway and looked around at the faces of people who had chosen to be here, people who valued me without conditions. A year ago, I might have thought gatherings like this were only possible within the bonds of family. Now I knew better. True family is built on respect, trust, and mutual care, and I had found mine outside the walls of the house where I grew up. As the evening wound down and the last guests left, I stepped out onto my small balcony. The night air was cool, carrying the faint smell of thawing earth. I thought about how far I had come, Not just the miles walked through the storm, but the miles I had traveled inside myself to get from a place of fear and obligation to one of safety and choice. I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the quiet satisfaction of knowing that whatever came next, I was ready and I would never again let someone else decide whether I was worthy of warmth.